I, Hugh Birch, unmarried, of the city of Chicago and state of Illinois, having in mind the scene of my early youth, where many cherished hours were spent with companions, tramping through the wooded glen and the woods and fields adjoining, in enjoyment of its natural beauty and in search of botanical and other specimens during my days as a student at Antioch College, and being desirous of establishing a memorial to my loving daughter Helen Birch Bartlett through the preservation of these woods, cliffs, springs, streams, and other natural features of the glen, and of certain lands adjoining, as a preserve for birds, fish, and game, wildflowers, trees, shrubs, and vines, and other forms of life, as a laboratory for botanical, zoological, archaeological, geological, and other scientific studies.
Nobody knows what the Yellow Spring looked like when the Indians first discovered it, before pioneer Lewis Davis built a cabin at the springs, before the Owenite colony failed and Elisha Mills bought the springs, before Elisha Mills' son, Judge William Mills, laid out the town of Yellow Springs, gave money and land for Antioch College, and brought Horace Mann here as president, before the old Neff Hotel, or the new one, before the water cures and the Memnonia cult, before Hugh Birch bought the land. But we do know that first of all came the land, these woods, cliffs, springs, and streams. Prehistoric man had known the glen. 2 Neolithic skeletons were discovered here in 1924 by the Grinnell Mill. Blasts from the calcium carbonate mine uncovered them. Later, Indians knew the glen. One excavation of the Indian mound near the Yellow Spring revealed a male adolescent from the Adena culture, which thrived in Ohio from 1000 to 300 BC. By the 1800s, the springs were well known, as this diary entry from 1814 proves. Arose early and took a view of the spring, which is a natural curiosity. The spring appears perfectly clear when taken up in a tumbler, but has a different taste from common water, and as it runs out of and down the bank, it lets fall a yellowish sediment. The old stagecoach road ran through the glen in the early 1800s, making the springs a comfortable day's journey from Cincinnati. Before that, it was called the Bullskin Trace. Before white men had a wagon road, Indians had a track through the woods. They would take a bull hide and put things on it, dragging it over a path with a horse. When the stage road came through, mills and houses began to spring up. Some remains can still be seen. Soon after Lewis Davis built a cabin near the springs in 1804, the spring's curative powers, as well as the natural beauty of the land, began to attract people. Among them was Robert Owen, a British reformer and socialist. In 1825, he tried to start a perfect community near the Cascades. Dr. William Galloway of Xenia once said he doubted whether this would please Mr. Birch, since the colony was an experiment in utopian socialism. Near the Owenite site, a few hundred feet upstream, there was once an old bridge on the stagecoach road between Yellow Springs and Clifton. This muddy path gave way to the present Clifton Pike. The bridge was restored in 1930, and again after the 1954 flood.
In the early 19th century, before steam power came in, the small-scale water power was a very important part of the rural economy. And there came a time when steam came in and the small-scale water power went out, the settlements moved up onto the level land, and the old valley settlements were largely abandoned.
The Owenites disbanded after quarreling in 1826, and Elisha Mills bought the springs in 1827. By 1829, he was advertising widely. Miss Cosmelia Hurst, who was there, wrote, "When Elijah Mills became owner, he did not tear away the log house put up by Mr. Davis, but added to it."
Judge Mills told that during the Harrison campaign of 1840 that he heard one afternoon speeches for old Tippecanoe, that was William Henry Harrison, delivered by two of the most remarkable men of the country, Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. They spoke from the summer house on the mound. There used to be a little rustic summer house. I have a picture of it there you can see. I can remember when that was still there.
In 1842, the Neff family of Cincinnati bought the resort from Mills, and people came to picnic, to take the water, to dance. The medical profession endorsed the idea of water cures, and 5 or 6 buildings were operated in the Glen by a series of 4 groups of physicians, the first in 1848. One Yellow Springs resident could recall in 1931 that the largest, called the Glen Forest Water Cure Sanitarium, was 3 or 4 stories high, painted white, and located on an open plateau surrounded by fine forest trees and extensive lawn. Today, in the area below the confluence of Yellow Springs Creek and Birch Creek, you can still find the remains of the pond from the water cures. Water was brought down from this spring between Grinnell Road and the railroad tracks by wooden well liners mounted on tall stilts. A long driveway curved down this hill, leading into the sanitarium. Board and treatment cost $7 to $10 per week. It was advertised for the invalid and for those who desire to leave our cities during the summer months. In 1852, after the cures began operating, Antioch was built. In 1853, the well-known educator Horace Mann became the first president of the co-ed college. Judge Mills also platted the village of Yellow Springs. By now, Mills occupied the Mills House in town on the site of the present Mills Lawn Elementary School. Mills also built the Yellow Springs House, a second resort hotel. By 1855, it was thriving on the site now occupied by the Bryan Community Center.
The water cure was there before the Memnonia, and it sort of went down. And then the Memnonia people came from the east and took over, this Dr. Nichols and his wife. And their reputation followed them. They didn't have a very good reputation in the east. They were supposed to be free lovers and so on. And of course, that didn't go down with Horace Mann in the village.
Then, in 1856, a year after they came, Mrs. Nichols had a vision of a Jesuit which she took as a sign. The Nichols left for Cincinnati, where they became Catholics. In 1857, Horace Mann called Erastus Birch to be on Antioch's Board of Trustees. The Birches lived in a house on the corner of Walnut and Dayton Streets in Yellow Springs. Among their children was a 9-year-old boy named Hugh Taylor Birch.
Hugh, a small boy at that time, had played with Benny Mann, Horace's son.
Even then, the Glen lands were used by students and faculty.
It is rather amusing in the light of present-day freedoms to read that in earlier periods there was a regulation by the college that men might use the Glen on certain days of the week, and that the women could do so on alternate days.
By 1859, when Horace Mann died unexpectedly, the water cure buildings were abandoned, as were the bowling alley buildings nearby. The college had to close for a year when students went off to fight the Civil War. And part of the present Glen was bought by Reverend Moncure Conway, said to have been influenced by Horace Mann.
Moncure Conway of Virginia brought his slaves just before the Civil War and gave them their freedom. There existed here a small cottage. At one point I secured money with which to restore the cottage, thinking that it would be a historic site.
The remains of the cottage can still be seen. Loretta Pritchett remembers that one of her sisters lived there, and that for a while the cellar of the cottage was a hideout on the Underground Railroad.
Uncle Dunmore and Aunt Liza, they said that he came ahead and bought the place, and then he had to pay so much for Aunt Liza to come. I didn't know, just I hear her parents talk about that she was a very religious little woman. He was a great big man, about 6 foot something.
By 1869, young Hugh Birch was in college at Antioch.
While a student, Mr. Birch came under the influence of Professor Edward Orton, a prominent geologist who later became the first president of Ohio State University. It was Orton's influence that excited Mr. Birch about the beauty of the Glen area.
Birch was trying to finish college in 3 years, playing baseball, starring in student plays. But he didn't graduate in 1869. One story has it that he played an important baseball game instead of taking his exam in analytical geometry. In any case, he left for Chicago without graduating, hoping to make his fortune in law. And the first Neff Hotel was beginning to get old.
Men from Cincinnati formed a corporation, and they raised about $197,000, something like that, to build the hotel. Well, they needed $200,000, so Yellow Springs contributed, this little village contributed $3,000 to make up the $200,000. And then that big hotel was built. And just thousands of people came here, and people of great repute. When we go over there and see just the natural beauty of the Glen, we forget that at one time that place was just alive with people of repute that came here to stay. Sometimes they'd stay 3 months at a time, but it is an immense big affair for this place, of course. 4-story building, 300 rooms, and one of the main parlor was almost 100 feet long.
The hotel was built by 1870, but by 1882, its popularity had worn thin. People could travel farther by rail, and the hotel was torn down by 1892. Then, in 1901, the Glen had visitors again.
The coming of the attraction was one of the great events of the town. I remember as a very small child, it did not come through until about 1901, finally. And it was hourly service, 35-cent round trip to Springfield or Xenia, and you could go frequently. It was, I think, more convenient than automobiles now, and it was a loss when it was discontinued. The Neff Park, which had been closed to the general public for many years, was finally opened and was quite a summer resort for a number of years. Mr. Neff made the lake, the dam, the creek, and had a boathouse, and then he built the dance hall, which was a fairly large structure and an excellent floor.
We would go to the dances, my brother and I, when they give big dances over there. And it was it was a gorgeous place. The floor was 3 layers, and hardwood at that. And we had some very famous bands come there and play.
In 1907, Simeon Fess, president of Antioch and U.S. Senator from Ohio, who lived in this house in Yellow Springs, brought the Chautauqua to Yellow Springs as part of the Antioch Summer School. They were often held in the Glen. Sometimes as many as 5,000 people came.
Every summer they had Chautauqua. And people came from everywhere and stayed the whole summer.
In 1914, Town Carlisle bought part of the Neff grounds, the dance pavilion, and the Yellow Spring. Then, in 1915, the Army camped in the north part of Neff Park and held training battles in the hills between Allen Street and Hyde Road, and between Route 68 and Grinnell Road. But even in those days, the dance pavilion was popular, and the Glen was famous. People came to walk, to take the waters, to take pictures, to send postcards. Pompey's Pillar seemed the most popular choice. In 1919, the last Neff sold the land to John Bryan. When Bryan died, his widow had a bank put the land up for sale. By that time, Arthur Morgan was president of Antioch College.
I went to the bank and asked them if we couldn't buy that of them, just in front of the college. They said no, they were going to sell that to a farm that's going to put an amusement park there with the shoots and so forth. But for that thing to happen right in front of the college, it'd go a long way towards spoiling the college, such as it was.
The Glen itself was very different in the 1920s. There was a big frame building over just as you approach the Yellow Spring from this side. Off to the right, there's a level area. There was a big frame building there that we used to serve refreshments out of, and a big open space where we played baseball and had picnics.
Yellow Springs resident Andrew Benning remembers that the lake was a special attraction.
Yeah, swimming in it. The bridge went across what a dam is now, what a dam was. We dove off of that into the lake. Yeah, they had cattle in there and sheep.
In the winter, there was ice skating on the lake, like these skaters from 1926. About this time, Aljo Henderson, future business manager, dean, and college president, arrived. He learned quickly about the proposed amusement park and about the village water problems.
Together with my wife Ann, we arrived at the Yellow Springs Railroad Station and were met there by Dean Philip C. Nash. He took us immediately to a house that he had reserved for us. After looking through the house, he led us out to the street corner to show us a pump used by the several neighbors. This is where we were to get our water supply. He did not show us a little shack on the back of the lot where one, with leisure and meditation, could thumb the pages of the Montgomery Ward catalog.
Organized a water supply district and condemned this as a source of water supply.
That saved the Glen from the amusement park, but the college needed money for the purchase. That was supplied by Mrs. Jessie Armstrong and Mr. and Mrs. Orlo Price, friends of the college. At one point, money was borrowed from George Little of Xenia, a graduate of Antioch and a former trustee. But the water supply district had problems and disbanded.
The water was the bane of the housewives because, having an iron content, it badly stained all of the basins.
At that point, Clara Dawson, widow of former Antioch President William Dawson, discovered Mr. Hugh Taylor Birch.
Along in the late 20s, I think it was, Mrs. Morgan and a friend of hers were going on down to Florida by auto. And before they left, Professor Inman spoke to Mrs. Morgan, and she said, now there's a man in Florida that attended Antioch, and he has some money. You can't get anything out of him. You write to him and never get any response. You can look him up. And the two of them got down there. They looked up Hugh Birch, and he was not much interested in him, but as a matter of routine, he took him around, showed them his place, and as he said later, they were the first women he ever met that had any intelligent interest in outdoors. So he quite took to them. He came up here, and then he and I wandered over the Glen, and it was his old paths.
So he fell in love with the author, and he fell in love with the Glen.
Mr. Birch was given his Antioch degree 60 years late.
Mr. Birch decided to have the Glen as a memorial to his daughter Helen, and we all thought that the name Glen Helen was very appropriate. From that time on, it became Glen Helen.
Anona Stoner lived with the Morgans as social secretary during the time Mr. Birch visited them.
He looked vigorous and stately, a large man, the well-tailored outdoor man, English tweeds and the Scotch plaids. And after all, he was a man of considerable years, and he was a person interested in natural foods, true egg yolks, and he would have whole wheat cereal, as I recall, and the whole grain cereals, and bread and honey and milk, and alfalfa tea. Now, alfalfa tea was the greatest thing on earth. His was a real dedication not only to the memory of his daughter, but strictly, I shall always believe that it was just as much to the feeling that he wanted to preserve this area and leave it for others. I don't think probably people realize the tremendous task that was to get that particular spot of land.
Mr. Birch decided that a book should be written about the Glen. So Lucy and Anona went to work on it.
They went to the Birch Bartlett summer home in Beverly, Massachusetts to work on the book.
This beautiful, magnificent place with the English butler and all the servants and so on. And we were there supposedly to do work on the book. And this consisted of working in the morning, perhaps an hour, and then you always went for a wonderful drive in the afternoon. The dining room overwhelmed Mrs. Morgan, that we were served all these elegant, angel food cake, but various forms of meringues and so on. That he said probably the cook was glad to have a chance to use the egg whites. About halfway through our visit, she got a little overwhelmed, and she just liked to get away, and she just liked to please have a good glass of buttermilk and just something simple.
So I wrote the story of Glen Helen, which pleased him very much, and he gave me an automobile to pay me for it.
I began showing the land adjoining the Glen, and he took interest in that. Lots of little pieces along the way, so we had about a 4-mile trip along there. 1 or 2 pieces there which he thought that he would pay the price.
One of the things Mrs. Armstrong did for Glen Helen in 1930 was to develop an English garden, modeled on this one in Shrewsbury, England, in the small quarry in the Glen. It was called the Dingle Dell.
The quarry had been filled with wrecked automobiles, beer cans, and everything imaginable, but it became a beautiful spot.
Now, Mr. Birch admired the building so much that he asked me as superintendent building him a house. And he said to me, we were living in what's called the Morgan House now. He said, I want a real big house, not a little place like this. So he picked the place and picked the size. But between us, we got the house done in 1931.
He had had a summer home in Massachusetts, but presently chose to spend his summers in Yellow Springs. It was always a bit exciting to greet Mr. Birch as he arrived for the summer because of the numerous trunks and also the 3 servants that he carried with him. Over a period of 2 or 3 years, we continued to buy the tail ends of farms. Thus, the Glen area was extended from the original 60 areas to approximately 1,000. But when Morgan suddenly left the college in May 1933 to become chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority, Mr. Birch was tremendously disappointed.
Mr. Birch took a dim view of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal.
For a period of time, it became nip and tuck whether the college would be able to retain his interest. Indeed, some of us weekly spent many hours with him. One day, I was riding with Mr. Birch. All of a sudden, he asked his chauffeur, Carlos, to stop. Pointing across one of the fields, he asked what that object was rising above the level of the land. It proved to be a large glacial boulder about half buried in the ground. Mr. Birch decided he wanted to have the boulder, and so it was moved to this entrance of the Glen, and this is the rock on which the bronze plaque was placed. We're at the conclusion of these purchases. I wrote out a deed that Mr. Birch then signed to represent his total gift of the Glen to the college.
Mr. Birch, I say he got his economic foundation by cleaning up these tracts out of Chicago. And he developed a passion for what he called improving spring.
Carlos Riccardi was Mr. Birch's constant companion. They both worked in the Glen. Mr. Birch often dug up springs himself.
He spent a lot of money on up in there, back the conifers there.
Those were the Horace Mann Lakes, now called the Birch Pools, northwest of the pine forest near the cypress trees.
Well, those have grown very well. Those are coming to be quite sizable trees now, with the cypress knees sticking up out of the ground.
They call them the bald cypress. Well, you do remember when Mr. Birch set aside that big tree back there in the conifer area, calling it the Horace Mann study tree, where Horace Mann used to sneak off by himself, and concentrate on whatever happened to be bothering him. Of course, it struck by lightning 2 or 3 times, finally died.
Birch arranged a trade with Bryan Park to incorporate Horace Mann's farm and make the Glen boundaries more uniform. That's how the Glen acquired the pine forest, with the conifers the state planted in 1926. In 1935, Antioch became part of a centennial honoring Horace Mann, thanks to Aljo Henderson, then president of the college.
When I told Mr. Birch of our plans, he became quite enthusiastic. He was aware of the bronze statue of Horace Mann that stands in front of the State House in Boston. He discovered that the molds from which the original statue had been made were being preserved in a foundry in Munich, Germany. So he arranged to have another casting made. We dedicated this monument as a part of the Horace Mann centennial.
In the early 1940s, the Glen lost two of its best friends. Dr. Anders Inman, professor of biology, who died unexpectedly in 1942, and Hugh Taylor Birch, who died in January of 1943 at age 94. The college dedicated a new trail to Dr. Inman. Mr. Birch had already left a legacy.
My introduction to the Glen was rather stunning. I had come to town the day after Christmas, 1945. At that time, the lake was still pretty much a lake there. There was still enough water in the lake that people would clear off spaces, and there'd be lots of skating down there. People would, boys and grown-ups too, would sled down from near the Yellow Spring down out onto the lake. And it was a really beautiful place.
That was how Keith Howard, editor of the Yellow Springs News from 1945 through September 1976, first saw the Glen.
Mr. Birch's will also left the sum of $500,000 as an endowment for Glen Helen. This enabled the college to employ the services of Dr. Kenneth Hunt as the first director of Glen Helen. Dr. Hunt had a Doctor of Philosophy degree from Cornell University and had specialized in biology.
As it worked out, I was appointed Associate Professor of Biology and Director of Glen Helen, with my time to be devoted 1/3 to the biology department teaching and 2/3 to the management of the Glen. I think most of the time I worked 100% of the time for the Glen and somehow did the teaching on top of that. We provided a good access into the valley by designing a set of stone steps, but work went slowly. At that point, President Henderson suggested to me that I should get in touch with the man who for years had worked in the Glen as a helper and companion to Hugh Taylor Birch. This man was Carmelo Ricciardi, or Carlos Riccardi, as everybody knew him.
Somebody got to get in there and do something, start digging, and open up all the trails, and they have a good turn up all the springs, whatever we can get it to it, and they have a bridge, whatever it needs, and many millions of other things.
The stone for these steps was extracted from the old lime kilns that were along the railroad track across from the college. After the steps were done, Riccardi used lime kiln rock to make the Inman Terrace. And if you look carefully there, you'll find some of the stones are pinkish colored due to the heat of the fires in the kilns. After this, we were ready for a major project, the landscaping of the Yellow Spring. And we called in Louise Odeon, a very public-spirited citizen and landscape architect of Yellow Springs, to design an effect there which would seem like a continuation of the ledge that ran north and south of that spot. I might mention that there was a great deal of skepticism on campus about this plan. So Louise prepared a diagram of her plan, and then I also asked one of the art department faculty, Robert Whitmore, to do a painting of his concept of how it would look when finished. And we put the two things on display, and we got a stack of notes from students saying, "Oh, don't do Louise's, do Whitmore's. We erected a stone boat to haul from the Jeep, an I-beam derrick chin pole to lift the stone, lower it into place, and after 2 years' time, we had the Yellow Spring as you see it today. As Christmas approached, I was dismayed to discover people coming into the pine woods to help themselves to Christmas trees. So I could see we had a public relations problem.
Someone suggested to Dr. Hunt that a school forest was an excellent education project.
Well, we tried this out tentatively with a tree planting day for the high school youngsters in April 1947. And the thing took hold. We made a formal agreement with the Yellow Springs school system in January 1949, granting them the use of 100 acres of Glen land. Meanwhile, thinnings were made each December from the conifer plantation for sale at a Christmas tree festival. The next project was the construction of the Trailside Museum. We felt strongly from the beginning that the function of the Glen was to encourage people to appreciate, to understand, and to enjoy nature. But nature is mute, and it needs interpretation.
It was a student project from beginning to end, except for the design by Reed Viemeister, a Yellow Springs design engineer. The timber and the stone came from the Glen.
The dedication of Trailside was in November 1952. The after-school nature group met there, eventually transformed into what we now call Junior Naturalists. By then we had the idea of an outdoor education camp on our list of aims for Glen Helen. The idea was to get volunteer labor and to scrounge salvage materials to set up the first building or two. When on June 6, 1954, 10 inches of rain fell over the Yellow Springs Creek and Birch Creek watersheds, much of it in 3 hours. This flood was rather a death blow to the Glen Pond. This also deprived the old pavilion of any scenic setting, added to the fact that the state fire marshal had closed down the one useful function we had found for it as a roller skating rink. We were quite ready for it to find a new incarnation as timbers in the school camp buildings.
Students, both college and high school, began by tearing down the dance pavilion. Work continued for 2 years under the direction of Antioch professor Ed Miller. Salvage material was shaped into Cedar Center and the Outdoor Education Center office.
In September 1956, the Outdoor Education Center was formally opened with these 2 buildings and with Gene Sanford as its first director.
So we had quite a big selling job in the early days, but once we had children and adults there, the ripple effect worked very well. Children went back and brought their parents to the Glen on the weekend, and of course ours was a rather quick success story.
The college acquired grant money to construct the rest of the buildings, and Gene Sanford Replinger began to get letters from children who appreciated their days at the school camp. For example,
I'm very grateful to you for having this camp. If you didn't have it, I would be blank on many things in the forest. When I first came to camp, I didn't even know what a lichen looked like. Now I could spot lichen, liverwort, and other plants easily. P.S. If you can't remember me, I was a dead plant in the charades.
But then, in the late 50s, 2 kinds of encroachment tested the existence of Glen Helen as a nature preserve.
By September 1958, it became clear that the village was serious about putting a sewer line through the Glen. Also in September, the State Highway Department approached the college about a highway route through the Glen. Gene Capel was named chairman of a land relationship committee. At its October 1958 meeting, shortly after the breaking of the news about sewer and highway, the council urged immediate and forceful action. We sent out hundreds of letters. I was told that the state highway director complained that he couldn't find his mail because it was buried under a flood of protest letters. On October 31st, Governor O'Neill announced that he was directing the Highway Department to avoid going through Glen Helen. An election was coming up and may have influenced his decision. Unfortunately for the highway situation, O'Neill was defeated.
Friends of the Glen set up a meeting at Antioch with Yellow Springs government, college personnel, and the Highway Department people. Ken Hunt took them on a tour of the Glen.
I had alerted various people, so on the tour we saw kids swarming at the school camp, a school bus unloaded at Trailside, a physical education group putting their canoes into the Little Miami, and a high school work group in the school forest, and we all left hopefully. Finally, in late March, the new Governor DeSalle announced that the highway would go west of town. However, now 20 years later, no highway has been built. Meanwhile, the sewer issue is intensifying.
Yellow Springs is a hard town to sewer, and this resulted in the village not having any central sewage disposal plant until the mid-30s. As the village grew, the lines became too small. The fact that there was going to be a conflict didn't come to my notice until 1959, when the village was about ready to let out plans.
And the curious thing to me was that people in the community who were indignant about the highway thought the sewer was just fine.
So it was sort of an in-family sort of a controversy. Vernay and his local backers called themselves the Committee to Save the Glen, and there were big debates almost every council meeting. Several times the village council announced that they were going to court.
Well, as council said, this was the largest single capital commitment, around $400,000 that the village had ever had to make.
Ken Hunt went to his advisory board, of which Cale and I were members, but I don't think we got invited to that meeting.
This tension had to be relieved. I'd forgotten the Battle of the Limericks. This is a marvelous one. To Dixon from council, let's map a plan that will finish this flat. Since you've made all this fuss to put pressure on us, please give us a hand of the craft. Said Glen Helen, it's utter futility to pine for the old-time civility. I would rather, said she, be a poor amputee than give birth to a public utility.
On February 27, 1960, the settlement was finally reached. The sewer would keep out of the Glen. The college would contribute some Glen pasture land between Grinnell Road and Hyde Road, and the college would also contribute $42,000 to the village. The greater part of this was given by one Antioch trustee, Sergius Vernay.
Since I've often wondered if the major achievement in that was the high respect and personal friendship the four leading characters in the drama had for one another, and I've wondered if there was not some backroom meetings.
Directly after this, the Glen Advisory Council formally proposed a Glen Helen Association, utilizing as its nucleus the Committee to Save the Glen. This association held its first meeting September 1st, 1960, with Beverly V. Meister elected as chairman. In 1961, a combined effort was recommended by Glen Helen and the adjoining state park and youth camps to make a solid green island between Yellow Springs and Clifton. The name for this effort of a country common was first reported in the Glen Helen Association newsletter, September 15, 1961.
Then, in the early 70s, work began on a new central office for Glen Helen. Through the generosity of the Vernay Foundation, the building is dedicated to the memory of Sergius Vernay, who contributed so much of his vitality to the cause of Glen preservation. When Dr. Kenneth Hunt retired in 1973, the Glen hired a full-time director, Ralph Ramey. Ralph has a master's degree in environmental education from Ohio State University, experience with the state park system and natural resource legislation, and talents that he immediately put to use as a photographer, as a naturalist writer, as a lecturer, as a naturalist guide, sometimes as a pressman, or an eagle sitter, a mover of covered bridges.
It is most satisfying to me, most gratifying to me, that in this building, under the direction of Ralph Ramey, Such imaginative and vigorous leadership has been provided in these critical times for Antioch and Glen Helen. But really, more significantly, I think the extraordinary service which Glen Helen and the Glen Helen Association are now rendering to a wide public are its strongest protection. And also, I think people are much more ready today to appreciate the fundamental message of the Glen Helen program, that all life is interrelated and all of us are most secure and most happy if we live as part of that interrelated whole.
But the value of the Glen is easier to see than to talk about.
Well, spring really comes to the Glen, I guess, in late February with the blooming of skunk cabbage. And it won't be very long after that one of the real special flowers of Glen Helen, the snow trillium, comes into bloom. Then there's a whole profusion of flowers that follow: Dutchman's breeches, the squirrel corn, wild blue phlox, hepatica, of course, in the early spring. Continuous show of flowers in the Glen all the way from late February through September. It'd be hard to say that there's anything else as lovely as a butterfly weed or a New England aster in the fall. They each have their own place, their own time, their own season.